Every show is a bit of a crisis. It gives you a chance to look at what you've done and to assess. It wasn't very easy to become a sculptor. And one day my parents said, well, if that's what you really want, you better do it. Which surprised me very much.
We're incredibly excited that my father is having a show up at the Hepworth Wakefield Museum, which is an amazing museum, and 8 miles away at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. This is probably the largest retrospective of his work ever in Britain. It's really an oasis of wonderful art, both those two sites.
Because of the broad range of his work and how much he made over this half a century, it's really fantastic for the public to see 2 exhibitions across 2 venues, one of which looks at the relationship to painting and one of which looks at the relationship to architecture.
It's very interesting because Anthony Caro emphatically is an urban sculptor. His materials are the fabric of urban buildings, steel. And he always had a slightly, I thought, disingenuous and over-worrying attitude to the landscape. Because he always used to say, if I put my sculpture in the landscape, there's a danger it litters the landscape or that the landscape overwhelms it, and I'm not interested in a kind of romantic poetry. And yet, when you see his sculpture in a landscape like this, you realise that it can both confront the landscape, have a creative relationship with it, and actually engage with something that you don't always associate with Caro, which is the sublime.
Anthony Caro came to the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in 1978. We started in 1977, and he was the first major artist to come to the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. He actually came with his wife, Sheila Girling, the painter, and also Philip King, who then became a trustee. But Tony was so enthusiastic. He had great concerns about showing his sculpture in the open air, but he was a great enthusiast for sculpture in general and wanted to support everything we were attempting to do here.
I think it looks wonderful, and I think that it's any work that is strong enough and robust enough to carry itself, as Caro's work does, will work in this kind of environment.
Although he had reservations about putting sculpture in the open air, he did loan Sculpture 7, which is in this exhibition. He felt that was strong enough and powerful enough to take on the landscape. It has a horizontality about it. And he talked about making sure that we had a base, a clear base, to show it in, and there weren't, and we didn't have too many intrusions in the background.
My father's sculptures are very much about space, and particularly the early sculptures. When you see Month of May, those very early colour pieces play on that tension between being a physical object in our world and being ephemeral feeling in our heads. It's very much about defining the space they're in. It's hard to know what is happening because your visual brain reads it and your auditory brain doesn't know what's going on. All it knows is it's wonderful.
The thing about Caro is that he was just never satisfied. He was always thinking about the next work that he wanted to make. And it's this kind of inventiveness and always wanting to push the boundaries of sculpture that led him to have such a remarkable career over 50 years of work and working with all different types of material and always kind of pushing himself forward and forward. So, you know, he made works in the 50s that were pretty successful, but he wanted to do something completely different. He was never satisfied.
The earlier work was done in Camden and done in Finchley Road, just off the Finchley Road. That was where he did the more elegant work. And then as he moved to Camden Town, he started to shift towards sort of the weightier, grander work. We went for a couple of years, we used to go walk on the Heath together in the morning, 2 or 3 times a week. And we actually discussed these sort of issues about should one, elegance, and clarity versus weight and power, and romantic versus classical, and trying to figure out things like this. And he'd often discuss we'd discuss things like, who was better, Rembrandt or Matisse? And it's quite fun to, think about artists from different periods and ask which one, do you want to sculpt your soul on? Which ones are the ones that you really want to sort of take into your soul and believe in?
There's a potency about the late work, and there's a sense of imagination, there's a sense of questioning and pushing forward that he never lost. When I was still a postgraduate student, I'd written a review for Art Monthly magazine where I was slightly critical of the source sculptures that he'd first produced, work that was directly in relationship to paintings, Manet, Monet, Rembrandt and Rubens. And so I was summoned to see him, to meet him. I mean, I'd met him once before, but I thought, blimey, is this how the British art world works? You get summoned up to see the headmaster. But I thought, well, I better go respectfully, and I'm interested to hear what he has to say. And actually, it turned out that he was interested in my criticism. And we had a conversation where, in the end, the more I argued with him or engaged with him, and actually the more I thought about the work, I actually started to take the opposite view.
He often had music on when he worked, and he loved to listen to Mozart and to Schubert. At the end of the 60s, 69, he came to this quite large piano factory in Camden Town. His output grew, so he was doing 1 or 2 pieces at a time when in the previous studios, and he was able to have a whole series of works going on at once. When he did the piece in wood, he was listening to earlier music that had a more vertical and horizontal feel to it, which kind of went with a sort of more rectilinear, sort of ordered feel to it, like a sort of ordered dance, which went with the feel of the sculptures. It's quite interesting how he felt that he had to listen to a certain sort of music that was slightly more wooden in feel to go with the sort of wooden nature of the work.
Here at the Hepworth Wakefield, we're looking at the relationship that Caro's work had with architecture. It's been so wonderful when we're working in a building like this. So I'm really lucky to work at the Hepworth Wakefield, where David Chipperfield-designed these beautiful galleries, and the work just absolutely comes alive.
The work looks fantastic installed in here. Chipperfield's vision and Caro's creative energy and vision actually work beautifully together. And actually everything from early figurative works, where Caro talked about what it was like to inhabit a physical body, to the later pieces that have architectural detail, some of the Barcelona series, to that extraordinary terminus right at the end of his life, have an architectonic quality.
In 1990, he said in a lecture that his work had been he had been interested in the dialogue between sculpture and architecture since the early 80s, but when he looks back, actually he could see it was always there, even if it was just at the edge of his mind. And so this exhibition here at the Hepworth Wakefield traces that sort of history, called the conversation that he was having between sculpture and architecture, from the work in the 1960s all the way through to the last sculptures he made in 2013.
It's odd to describe someone whose status, I mean, not just the fact that he's knighted, he was an Order of Merit, and he's exhibited in most of the major museums in most of the major continents of the world, to say that he's underrated. But I think he is. I think his major contribution is that moment in the 60s, in British sculpture specifically, but internationally, where he knocks sculpture off the plinth onto the floor. It shares our space, it becomes more direct, it becomes confrontational in a much more obvious way. And it continues the legacy of constructivist sculpture, Picasso and Cubism, right through to David Smith, but actually takes it into a new territory.
In 59 and so on, I was sort of trying to think about what is the nature of this activity. And it isn't to do with making model ships. A pedestal, a base, it seems to me, defines the limits of the world of the sculpture. And the same is true with the general on a horse on a pedestal. He's other than oneself. And I wanted to make sculpture immediate, I mean, half the trouble is making things stand up anyway. And in a way, you could do away with a lot of that by using the ground. I don't want the ground just to be a base for a sculpture. I want the ground to play a part in the sculpture. I want the ground itself to seem to act in the sculpture.
The project Caro in Yorkshire is visionary, generous-spirited, complex and quite demanding of its audience. Because what you have is almost every aspect of Caro's rich career spanning the best part of 7 decades across 2 major sites, inside and outside, engaging with landscape, architecture, internal space, external space. And actually what the viewer does is create their own trail or trails through the exhibition. And although there's 10 miles between the two, you really need to see both halves. It can't be just one is enough. One is enriched by the other. There's a conversation between the 2 sites, and of course the theme or themes running through is this extraordinary creative energy.
I'm never happier than when I'm in the studio. And when I'm not in the studio, but when I'm in the studio on some project that's really got me fired up. I dream about it. I think about it before I go to sleep. I wake up next morning and that's in my mind. That's the best.